This is lecture number 40 in the series, The ABCs of Communism, that accompanies the textbook, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2016, and this will be the subject matter of chapter 57 in that book. Now, Ecuador, The Empire Strikes Back Against Ecuador is our title. Ecuador is a country where I've had considerable experience in the past for a variety of reasons, and as we go along I'll mention some of them because I think there are some insights I can provide here that will be helpful. But historically speaking, let's begin back with the formation of the Communist Party of Ecuador, Partido Comunista del Ecuador, PCE. From now on I'm going to use the English names and initials, so that's Communist Party of Ecuador, PCE. It was formed in 1925 after the Mexican Party's International Bureau carried out Comrade Borodin's assignment with regard to this country, and they accepted the Ecuadorian Socialist application to join the Third International. Now, from that moment forward, the PCE comrades went back to Ecuador and began working on building a base. In the next 20 years, they had built an extremely effective base across the country, and we'll touch on parts of that as we go along. Suffice it to say that in 1944, the PCE won 15 out of the 85 seats in the National Assembly, and it elected Nela Martinez as the first female National Assembly member. The PCE took the Ministry of Education in what was otherwise a bourgeois government. Now notice the year, this is 1944, this is when the U.S. was still in alliance with the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt had his FDR's policy of collaboration with the Soviet Union and with the communist parties around the world was in full effect. However, you know that he died shortly before the conquest of Berlin by the Red Army, and in 1946 the Cap government outlawed, that is in Ecuador, the PCE and jailed many of its members. Now this happened under direct orders from the Truman Gang via the U.S. Embassy in Quito. The PCE was re-legalized during the 1948-52 term of President Galo Plaza, however. Now, at the same time, the newly formed CIA took the point in implementing the Truman Doctrine. The Ecuador's government was still not following its orders as it was supposed to. Part and parcel of this now only official line of all U.S. imperialist institutions was to establish an anti-communist de facto fascism everywhere possible, and especially in Latin America. In Ecuador, in practice, this meant organizing the next outlawing of the PCE via a military coup. So the U.S. imposed a military junta on Ecuador in that year, 1946, and it lasted for another 2 decades, that is until 1966, and it was a typical alliance of the CIA with the most reactionary families in the nation. Meanwhile, in 1964, the PCE suffered a major split. The pro-China portion of the party constituted the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Ecuador, PCMLE. The Khrushchev Modern Revisionist Gang, having consolidated its power in the CPSU, was busy trying to do the same thing everywhere in the world. The Chinese, Albanian, and Cuban parties were all fighting back. When the PCE was re-legalized in 1988, most of its members were under revisionist control. Now, the PCE participated in congressional and presidential elections as part of the coalition of the, in English, Broad Left Front, FADI, which gained 13 seats in Congress in 1986. On the other hand, the PCMLE published En Marca and was an active participant in the International Conference of Marxist-Leninist Parties and Organizations, Unity and Struggle. The main strength of the PCE is its trade union work. The PCE plays a leading role in the Confederation of Ecuadorian Workers, or CTE, and the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Ecuador continued as well. Now, communists from both parties and other unaffiliated ones have concentrated in the police and military intelligence authorities of the Correa administration in the years following the CIA attempted coup of 2010. And when we're taking a look back this far in the early days of the Comintern, just to catch you up on where the party in Ecuador was, one of my favorite stories has to do with Litvinov, who was, as you know, if you've been watching these lectures or reading this book, was one of the chief bank robbers for Krasin in the Caucasus. And one of the other things he did, Maxim Litvinov did for the Bolsheviks, was to go around the world and buy arms. Well, there was a time in 1904 and 1905 when he was so busy attending arms sales, you know, these various weapons fairs they have in Europe and Japan, that he had been posing as an Ecuadorian colonel. Now, at that particular moment, there were three Ecuadorian governments fighting each other in Quito and Guayaquil and other parts of the country, so, you know, nobody really knew what an Ecuadorian uniform looked like, but he got one together, and he was from one of these three, so he said, and he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Tsar's officers who were over there buying weapons to use against the insurrectionaries in Russia. At any rate, I always got a kick out of that particular story, but you can see that for one reason or another, historically, Ecuador, in terms of its position within the struggle for communism, has had some kind of a role to play. Well, at any rate, in the post-1948 period, you may recall that there was in 1948, Warner Brothers brought out a cartoon called The Roadrunner versus Wiley Coyote, and sometimes that got to be just Roadrunner versus the Coyote. But it started in '48 at the same time, which is just a coincidence, as the CIA became a permanent shock troop organization to be used against communism in Latin America. So I've always considered that kind of interesting, because the role of the CIA in all of these Latin American countries has been pretty much like a whack-a-mole. They slam something down one place, it jumps up in the other, and they just keep going on after it. You'll recall that in these Roadrunner cartoons, the Roadrunner is always coming up with some kind of new screwy idea of the way to catch the Roadrunner. And I mean, the Coyote's always coming up with this kind of an idea about how to catch the Roadrunner and eat him. And it never actually works. He uses absurdly complex contraptions and elaborate plans to pursue his prey, which always comically backfire, with Wiley being seriously injured. Of course, Ecuador is just one of the countries constantly under gringo attack, but it is a comically instructive contrast with what has been going on in this particular arena. Ecuador has been extraordinarily successful in implementing social advancement in a constant tit-for-tat struggle against the CIA that employs absurdly complex contraptions and elaborate plans to derail the ongoing citizens' revolution, and it usually backfires to its chagrin, and that goes on to this very day. We're here today is the end of February of 2016. So let's take a background. What our job in this lecture is to see how the empire is currently striking back against Ecuador. Now, our background to Ecuador, we want to take a look at what happened there since the year 2000. Because on January 21st in 2000, the US CIA organized demonstrations in Quito using indigenous foci that they had been creating under Operation Condor. You'll recall our lectures on Operation Condor. Now, by indigenous foci, what I mean is they had been sending agents in to visit various tribes, especially along the Amazon, and try and create a little base, a little group there, one way or another. And so they had infiltrated the Ecuadorian military and the police at the same time, using their standard operating procedure of massive bribery. Consequently, these suborned entities refused to enforce public order, and this was the beginning of the year 2000 Ecuadorian coup d'etat. Now, demonstrators entered the National Assembly building, gangland style at that time, and declared a coup d'etat, placing a three-person junta in charge of the country. Suborned field-grade military officers, the field grade officers, our lieutenant colonels, colonels, and brigadiers, emerged declaring their allegiance to the junta. During a night of confusion and failed negotiations, then President Mahoud fled the presidential palace for his own safety, and Vice President Gustavo Alvaro Noboa took charge by his own decree. Mahoud went on television the next morning to endorse Noboa as his successor, and this new U.S.-imposed military junta accepted Noboa. The Ecuadorian Congress did its bid, met in an emergency session in Guayaquil, which is the second biggest city in the country and on the coast, on January 22nd, and ratified Noboa as President of the Republic. It soon became apparent, however, that Noboa was just the U.S. hand-picked neoliberal stooge for Ecuador. He continued the dollarization policy and ignored all the social problems following U.S. IMF, International Monetary Fund, dictates. The military junta presented one of its members, Full Colonel Lucio Guterres, to be president in 2002. He was then elected, that is, quote unquote, assuming the presidency on January 15, 2003. His Patriotic Society Party had a tiny fraction in Congress, but the CIA gave him the support of their suborned political parties to create a bloc sufficient in their view to justify passing legislation as Washington directed. So in December 2004, Guterres unconstitutionally dissolved and appointed new judges to the Supreme Court. The new Supreme Court dropped charges of corruption pending against a whole bunch of fascist exiles who soon returned to the country. Now, the corruption evident in these maneuvers finally led Quito's middle classes to seek the ousting of Guterres in early 2005. So, in April 2005, the Ecuadorian Armed Forces declared that it withdrew its support for the president, and after weeks of public protest, Guterres was deposed. Vice President Alfredo Palacio assumed the presidency and vowed to complete Guterres' term with elections to be held in 2006. Meanwhile, the Gringo Empire had been using Ecuador as a base for spying on the progressive movements in South America. That ended with the election of Rafael Correa to the presidency in 2006. On November 26th of that year, Rafael Correa defeated Noboa in a runoff election with 57% of the vote. The main U.S. government instruments for control of its colonies went to work. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, those instruments are USAID, USAID, 1, the National Endowment for Democracy, 2, the International Republican Party Institute, 4, 3, whatever, the National Democratic Party Institute for International Affairs, and the AFL-CIO International Office. These were immediately directed to follow the dictates of the CIA in its post-Condor strike-back program for Ecuador. Now, the U.S. State Department's Office of Transition Initiatives recruited local partners to achieve regime change in Ecuador and illegally funded hundreds of millions of dollars to their fascist Ecuadorian government annually. This is the same office that was set up to when they thought they were going to be able to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba. Of course, that didn't happen, and you know what's happened there. So they still had other work to do, however, and part of it was in Ecuador. The U.S. State Department's office not only recruited these people, but it funded them to the tune of hundreds of millions of U.S. dollars that were funneled into Ecuador to the fascist government annually. So, as usual, they're able to get the poor U.S. taxpayer, who doesn't have the slightest idea what's going on in the world, to fund their fascist organizing. Today, the CIA office comes under the Death Star U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru, and that's how they organize their anti-Ecuador activities, out of Lima, because that's where they have this incredible Death Star they've built out there on the edge of town. If you go to Google Earth and take a look at that place, it looks just like the Death Star out of the movie. But at any rate, by January of 2016, they had implemented the mechanics in a new anti-Correa front of nefarious criminal elements on the Ecuadorian political scene. Now, the current Correa administration refers to itself as the Citizens' Revolution, and this in order to contrast with Ecuador's history of criminal political gangland rule from Quito and Guayaquil, as in Gringolandian cities of Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and the fictional megalopolis Gotham. When I was a prisoner down there at Lima many years ago, the Guayaquil is a city right on the border of the Peru and Ecuador, but it's a huge city, and we've reviewed this before in terms of Latin American history, so it has a history going back into the colonial era at the very beginning, and was a major shipbuilding at that time, a wooden shipbuilding port for the Spanish Empire. Well, it has continued to this very day, being a huge center of commerce for all of South America, but especially northern South America, and of course in particular for Ecuador. When we were organizing countless escapes from prison in South America, one of the preferred routes was to go north on the Pan American Highway to Guayaquil. To the Ecuadorian border there. Find somebody to help you get across the river, and that is the border between the two countries. Get to Guayaquil, and from there it was a pretty simple matter to make your way back to the States by air or by sea. But a lot of funny things happened during that. There were 2 years where we had constant series of escapes, and most of them were organized as prison breakouts from this so-called Center for Social Readaptation in the Lurigancho Valley. But one of them, which I thought was particularly interesting, was a fellow who had gone from, this is before I got there, had gone from the prison to the courthouse downtown in Lima, was there at the same time that the police in the streets had rounded up hundreds of demonstrators who were demonstrating that day for one reason or another. I don't recall what it is. I think it's in the book I wrote about this. But at any rate, thrown them all in this same prison where these guys were waiting to go up in front of a tribunal. The Peruvian system is Napoleonic, so the way they do their criminal court is to have a three-man judge panel sitting up there waiting to take a bribe that they feel is sufficient to let the person go, or just send them back. Or if they're too lazy and too coked out, they just don't even bother to have a hearing that day, so your whole trip was worth nothing. At any rate, this one fellow, he ends up down there, and he knew his way around. His name was Andre, and he knew his way around because he'd lived in Peru for a while. When all of these new fellows were thrown in there, he had the foresight to walk up to the lieutenant and tell him, "Hey man, I was just out here on the street. I'm a U.S. citizen. They threw me in here. I don't have my ID or anything." And this lieutenant, he took him. He said, "Okay, I'll take care of that." Took him out, put him on the street. Well, Andre was smart enough to know that eventually somebody would notice that he didn't come back to prison, so he took off and headed for Guayaquil. Now, if you're escaping in Peru on the Pan American Highway, there's only one. There are two ways to go. You go at that time. You go south to Chile. You go north to Ecuador. Either that, or you go through the mountains and try and get into Bolivia across the lake there. But at any rate, he went to Guayaquil, and he went up there, and he went to find somebody that he had heard about to help him get across the river. And by the time he did that, the police had closed in on him, and they sent him back to Lurigancho, which is where I met him. But at any rate, that was one of the kind of comical things that would happen in those days. Let's go on here for a moment. What happened here in Ecuador was that the CIA, with its usual total incompetence, failed to recognize the person that was most dangerous to them. And he was Rafael Vicente Correa Delgado, Ph.D., born on April 6, 1963, and elected president of Ecuador in 2006. He survived a CIA coup attempt in 2010 that we're going to talk about more here in a few minutes, and was reelected in 2012 to serve as President of the Republic until 2017. And he is currently the leader of the PAIS Alliance, that is P-A-I-S, political movement. Correa is a Marxist, and his administration has focused on the implementation policies of poverty reduction. Now, politically, as we have seen, PAIS is committed to honest citizen rule, combating the native rich families organized gangland style with their foreign compradors. Correa has served as President pro tem of the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, and Ecuador has allied with Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua in ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America. Now, Correa was born in a middle-income family in Guayaquil. He did exceedingly well in the lower grades. He studied economics at the Catholic University of Santiago de Guayaquil and the Catholic University of Louvain in Brussels. He then traveled to the USA, entering the doctoral program at the University of Illinois, where he received his PhD. Returning to Ecuador in 2005, he became the Minister for the Economy in President Alfredo Palacios' government, successfully lobbying Congress for increased spending of health and education projects. Correa won the presidency on his own in the 2006 general election, with a platform criticizing the established political elites. Kind of like Trump and Sanders are today. Taking office in January 2007, he sought to move away from Ecuador's neoliberal economic model by reducing the influence of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He declared Ecuador's national debt to be illegitimate and announced that the country would default on over $3 billion worth of bonds. He said they had been bought in the international credit courts by the foreigners, and that they had succeeded in reducing, but he has succeeded in reducing the price of these outstanding bonds by more than 60%. And he also introduced an ongoing legal fight with the U.S. giant Chevron, which used to be Standard Oil of California, which is, of course, another Rockefeller property, over their dumping of crude oil into the Amazon and its tributaries. Now, Chevron succeeded in getting one district court in the Netherlands to rule in its favor in January 2016, and Ecuador is appealing that ruling. And these, you know what the Standard does, what it always done, is it buys a judicial decision in whatever country, in whatever court, whenever it needs it. At any rate, the 2007-2008 Ecuadorian Constituent Assembly drafted the 2008 Constitution of Ecuador, which was then approved via referendum. Now, the CIA strike back plan began immediately in the form of a staged energy crisis that they kicked off in November 2009. The resulting power rationing across the country was supposed to provide that justification. Now, it was in the atmosphere of this CIA attempted coup against President Correa in 2010 that all of the following is going down. That CIA Ecuador coup crisis began then in 30 September 2010 when elements of the national police blockaded highways. They then occupied the national parliament, blocked the Sucre International Airport in Quito and the Olmedo International Airport in Guayaquil, and took over TV Ecuador station in what they claimed was a strike to oppose a government sponsored law that supposedly reduced their benefits. Since the early hours of that morning, unrest and looting had been reported in 7 provincial capitals of the country due to the lack of law enforcement. This is something else that they do. The CIA will organize some kind of trouble, and then they'll go out and rob everybody that they think they can get away with robbing of whatever personal riches and possessions they have, and blame it on the uprising. But at any rate, President Rafael Correa went to the police headquarters in Quito and was attacked by the police, who threw bottles and tear gas canisters at him. Correa was escorted to a hospital in the same compound. According to the Cat Press in Ecuador and the U.S., El País, the New York Times, and El Correo, and to the President Correa himself, the policemen then surrounded the building and prevented him from leaving. From the hospital, Correa declared a state of emergency. and said that a coup d'etat was taking place, and attributed responsibility to the CIA-directed opposition. Police radio recordings from the night of 30 September revealed that the police intended to kill Correa. Thousands of civilians came out to support Correa and gathered around the hospital in which he was a hostage. Correa said that the police had tried to break into his room at the hospital to kill him, but police still loyal to him had secured the floor. Clashes occurred between the rebellious police forces and the loyal army and police forces, and they eventually rescued Correa after he had been held for 10 hours at the hospital. Now, from the hospital, he hadn't been just sitting there waiting for something to happen. Correa had declared a state of emergency. He went on radio and television, and he accused the opposition and security forces of an attempted coup and of orchestrating the protests. He stated that he was declaring a 5-day state of emergency in an attempt to restore order. This measure forced all radio and television stations to integrate as an emergency broadcast system for the countryside. Now, so the people of Ecuador from that point forward were able to watch everything that happened as a live event. He later spoke to on the national radio from the hospital as well, and he said he would not negotiate until the protests were called off, and added that he would leave either as president or as a corpse, and said the organizers of the protest would be punished. Ecuador's health minister said the events had left 8 dead and 274 people wounded. One of the casualties was a university student and another a police officer. 2 military personnel involved in the rescue operation were also killed. The Public Service Organic Law, drafted by the executive, was the CIA's excuse for triggering the coup. As of 30 September 2010, after 15 months of debate, this assembly had not yet finalized the law proposal. Latin American media as well as Correa's supporters expressed concern that events could follow the same course as the 2009 Honduran coup d'etat, in which another progressive Latin American president, Manuel Zelaya, had been overthrown by the CIA. By the afternoon, Telesur reported that the police, accompanied by former President Lucio Guterres' lawyer, Pablo Guerrero, attacked Ecuadorian state television and took control of the channels. Many attacks on journalists by rebellious police were denounced in Quito and other cities. Workers and equipment of Ecuador TV, Radio Pública, Ecuavisa, Teleamazonas, and El Comercio were objects of aggression, several Ecuadorian journalists being wounded. International journalists from AFP, the French news agency, and Telesur were attacked. Late in the evening, 3 teams of special police and army paratroopers joined elite army troops, themselves a part of a force of around 500 uniformed, loyal personnel, and rescued the president. This requisite armed skirmish with the CIA's police forces inside and outside the hospital building ended up with a number of people killed and wounded. This entire rescue from the hospital was shown live on Ecuadorian television as bullets hit his room. Venezuelan-American lawyer Eva Gollinger stated that investigators concluded coup forces were attempting to assassinate him before he could be rescued. As Correa was rescued, 4 bullets hit his armored car. So he just barely escaped with his life. President Correa went to the presidential palace where he gave a fiery speech to the public, thanking those who had come to Quito to support the citizens' revolution and democracy in our country, and thanking members of the government who risked their lives in support of him. He also thanked UNICEF and the other Latin American countries that had supported him, and then in your book I'll name all of them and the individuals and people that had stepped forward to criticize this CIA coup d'etat at the time, which was only 6 years ago. He criticized those who attempted the coup, saying, how could they call themselves police after acting like this against the people? And he said there would not be any immunity for the perpetrators, nor would there be any negotiations under duress. He called the attackers cowards and claimed to have spoken to officers who were holding him hostage at the hospital and asked them 2 questions. Have you ever been paid this well? and have you read the law? And they replied they had never been better treated than through his administration, and that they had not read the controversial law. When the protesters asked him to revoke the law, he answered that he did not have the power to do so, and that he would leave as president or as a corpse. In the end, he left with his head held high, and he asserted that the law would not be repealed because everything can be done through negotiations, not by military force. He concluded his speech saying, "History would judge us, and with greater courage we will ensure that our citizens' revolution would not be stopped by anything. Until victory, always," unquote. His criticism included statements saying his administration had supported the police and were stabbed in the back. These traitors brought shame to the national police. They sold out to the oligarchy and their Yankee backers and acted only because they had been bribed and were ignorant of the real content of the law. Now, in the aftermath, President Correa said the uprising was incited for political motives, and he accused former President Lucio Gutierrez and other opposition politicians excuse me, for attempting to instigate a coup. He said that there were infiltrators from the well-known political parties among the rebellious police, and police were chanting, "Lucio Gutierrez should be president," while Correa spoke to them. Gutierrez's former lawyer was spotted amongst a crowd of officers that stormed the building of the state television, ECTV, and cut off the transmission. Lucio Gutierrez, a former president ousted by popular uprising and leader of the opposition Sociedad Patriotica Party, Patriotic Society Party, had participated in the coup d'etat against Hamil Mahmoud. We started talking about the first of these coups. Journalist Jean-Guy Allard reported on the Radio del Sur the coup attempt was confirmed by the 2008 report by Defense Minister Javier Ponce. That report proved infiltration of the Ecuadorian police by U.S. intelligence agents. The CIA funded police equipment and operations and took over the payment of informers. In response, then U.S. Ambassador Heather Hodges stated that the U.S. works with the Ecuadorian military and police on objectives that are very important for security, including the fight against drug trafficking. This was a blatant lie aimed at covering up her own responsibility in the attempt to assassinate Correa and overthrow Ecuador's democratic government. Relations between the Ecuadorian and U.S. governments regarding Ecuadorian police forces that had been trained since 2009 went on, and the Ecuadorian government was quite unhappy about the U.S. involvement in the appointment of Ecuadorian police officials. And of course you can see what they were doing by taking over the payment of the cops and everything else that had to do with their welfare. They had become de facto the bosses of the cops, which was the whole reason. Now, there was a point I was going to make about this, and now I forgot what it was, but the Allard, at any rate, also referred to former CIA agent Philip Agee's description of U.S. involvement with the Ecuadorian police in the early 1960s. He cited his suspicion that the visit of several U.S. officials to Ecuador officially, quote, to deepen relations, unquote, during the months before the coup attempt was a pretext. Now, I discussed this matter with Agee when I was in Havana in May 2002. He provided some fascinating details that I've included here. More recently, Pepe Escobar of Asia Times also alleged that everyone in South America knows of U.S. involvement in this coup attempt, and he cites similar reaction to the Honduran coup. RT alleged a link between the School of the Americas and the attempted coup, and Venezuelan-American lawyer Eva Gollinger, the woman that Hugo Chavez used to call the girlfriend of the revolution, claimed that the coup attempt was part of a systematic U.S.-supported plan to destabilize member states of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, or ALBA, ALBA. She says that U.S. Ambassador Heather Hodges was sent to Ecuador by former President George W. Bush with the intention of sowing destabilization against Correa, in case the Ecuadorian president refused to subordinate himself to Washington's agenda, which of course he had. Towards that end, Hodges increased the budget of U.S. aid and the NED for social and political groupings that promote what she called U.S. interests. Gollinger says certain progressive social groups received financing and guidelines in order to provoke destabilizing situations, with progressive in quote marks. And then they go far beyond the natural expressions of criticism and opposition to any government. According to Gollinger, U.S. aid's 2010 budget in Ecuador was $38 million. Gollinger referred to the indigenous political party Pachakutik movement press release on 30 September asking for Correa's resignation because of his dictatorial attitude that had generated serious political turmoil and internal crises. In the statement, Pachakutik leader Claver Jimenez said that the situation of the police and armed forces in the coup attempt should be understood as a just action by public servants whose rights have been made vulnerable. Gollinger proved that the NED, and U.S. aid funded Pachakutik. She demonstrated that it calls for Correa's resignation and that it was right out of the playbook of the National Democratic Party Institute, NDPI. NDPI is one of those 4 institutes funded by NED as its primary mechanical operators. In its subversive work, in 2007, NED described Pachakutik being trained by the NDPI in triangle of party best practices and strategic planning methodologies. Then that's the name of the handbook, unquote. In turn, this is part of NDPI's Latin American Caribbean political party network of over 1,400 individual members, all of whom they fund under NED core grants, and then I list those numbers. If you're interested, you can read them in your book. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton provided her usual lies in expressing full support for President Rafael Correa and the institution of democratic government in that country. On 5 October, Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño also tried to make a peace, saying, "I firmly believe that Mr. Obama had nothing to do with this. I hope, I trust, that his main authorities also didn't." Well, you know, they know what's going on, but they were trying to make peace in those years. At any rate, there are ongoing investigations, which on the 1st of October, Julio Cesar Cueva, Quito's Metropolitan Police Chief, Marcelo Echeverria, the Provisional Police Commander, and Manuel Rivadeneiro Tello, the head of the barracks where Correa was attacked, were all arrested and detained. They were released the next day, but barred from leaving Ecuador pending an investigation for negligence, rebellion, and attempted assassination. According to the prosecutor, Gonzalo Marco Freire, Manuel Rivadeneiro Tello was trained at the School of the Americas, SOA. The School of the Americas Watch lists Rivadeneiro as having been trained at SOA from 25 February to 18 April 1980 in the CIA Armed Combat Cadet Group. Those of you that know about Latin America know this is the CIA's operational school in the Panama Canal Zone, since been moved to the U.S. But at any rate, on 5 October, Fidel Araujo, close collaborator of Lucio Gutierrez, was detained for investigations about his role in this attempted coup, and as TV has shown him among the rebellious police in Quito in the early hours of the strike. In addition, recorded dialogues between the policemen that surrounded the hospital where Rafael Correa was kept. The policemen announced their intentions to kill the president or have him out of office. Interior Minister Gustavo Alc announced the arrest of 46 police officers for alleged participation in the revolt. Prosecutors have voice recordings that implicate them. Correa also warned that there was still an ongoing conspiracy within the police ranks. Reports indicate the police went back to work the next day after Guayaquil was back to normal. The chief of police, Freddy Martinez, took responsibility and resigned following the attacks, saying A commander shown such lack of respect by his subordinates cannot stay in charge, unquote. The government said it would not purge the police force, but were looking for those responsible who would not be pardoned. Patricio Franco, the newly appointed police chief, asked the public to trust the police, saying the revolt was led by a group of foolish and crazy people, and he stressed the role of infiltrators. On October 1st, Correa issued a 3-day national mourning period for the dead, but did not revoke the 5-day state of emergency. Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño warned that the situation might not be over yet. We cannot claim total victory. We have overcome the situation for now, but we cannot relax. The coup attempt may have roots out there. We have to find them and pull them up. Correa told UNASUR foreign ministers that the CIA and its flunkies wanted to provoke a civil war. Correa's popularity had risen due to his welfare programs and a firm stance against the U.S. investors. He had refused to pay the illegitimate debt. Foreign oil companies in Ecuador have until November of this year to sign new contracts that will boost state control on the oil industry. Now, the president of the National Assembly of Ecuador condemned the uprising and said that the assembly would not be intimidated and that the mutiny was the result of a conspiracy. He called on the people of Ecuador to defend the democratic institutions. Citizens supporting Correa amassed in front of their provincial governments in a show of support. Afterwards, also, at the UN and the Organization of American States, Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, expressed concern over the coup attempt. The Organization of American States Permanent Council unanimously approved, by acclamation, a resolution supporting Correa's government and asked all the stakeholders to avoid exacerbating the political instability. The European Union's foreign policy chief called for law and order to be respected. And at the UNASUR, the Secretary General Nestor Kirchner at that time said South America cannot tolerate that corporate interests threaten and put pressure on democratically elected governments for fear of losing undue privileges. An emergency summit was held on the same night of these events, 30 September, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, attended by UNASUR member state presidents Evo Morales, Sebastián Pinera from Chile, José Mujica from Uruguay, Juan Manuel Santos from Colombia, Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, Alan Garcia from Peru, and host, in the absence of President Pro Tem Correa, Cristina Kirchner, along with representatives of Brazil, Paraguay, Guyana, and Suriname. There were two notable absentees. Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva did not attend because of the impending Brazilian general elections, and Fernando Lugo was absent because he was undertaking chemotherapy. A statement was issued condemning the coup attempt, reaffirming the regional compromise with democratic institutions, peace, rule of law, constitutional order, and human rights as means to regional integration, and announcing the adoption of a democratic clause as an additional protocol to the UNASUR Constitutive Treaty at the next Head of State Summit in Guyana on 26 November that year. It was established that in the case of further attempts, immediate and concrete steps would be taken, such as the closure of borders, suspension of commerce, air traffic, energy services, and other supplies, and it was decided that the foreign ministers from the South American countries traveled to Quito on October 1st that year. Correa again expressed his gratitude for the strong regional support he received. Now, in the book, I go through many of the statements that were issued by the various presidents and their governments about a whole bunch of things, but I'm not going to. I think you've got the picture. Now, what really provoked all of this was that Ecuador citizens' revolution retaking power from the old elites. President Correa marked 9 years in office in January 15th this year, just a little over a month ago. Now, having overseen the transformation of Ecuador, it will be his last full year in power after his most recent decision not to stand again for president next year. Correa will go down in history as one of the most successful Ecuadorian presidents. Ecuador before Correa, as we have seen, was politically and economically unstable. 7 presidents had been forced out of office in a decade. Neoliberal measures applied by previous administrations left the country one of the poorest and least developed in the region. The government of Rafael Correa undertook a series of deep reforms which have delivered remarkable changes for Ecuador's long excluded masses. In late 2015, Correa announced he would not seek another term, making 2016 this year his final full year as president for now. Correa has repeatedly warned that the country's political opposition and their allies in the cap media are set to unleash a dirty campaign against the government in 2016. According to Correa, their goal is to wear out the government and its supporters ahead of elections and win the country's National Assembly. Over these last 9 years, the National Assembly has debated and approved 188 laws aimed at reducing the power of powerful ruling families, giving more rights to the people, and bringing the country's laws in line with the 2008 Constitution. Recent laws saw the extension of rights for workers, including the recognition of domestic labor and transformative land law that redistributes idle land to those who have none, and a media law that seeks to democratize the country's airwaves. The National Assembly is set to analyze 36 new bills in 2016 on tourism, environmental protection, and biodiversity, the promotion of culture and health. The country's political progress under the leadership of Correa's País Alliance, in cooperation with grassroots organization, has built Ecuador's version of 21st century socialism, and it's into this government, especially in places where they can be most effective, that revolutionary communists in Ecuador have been attracted and have concentrated. I know that from my own experiences down there. 8 ways Ecuador revolutionized foreign policy models are, in what was perhaps Ecuador's boldest and most famous foreign policy move under the Correa administration, was granting asylum to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in Ecuador's UK embassy. But there has been much more to foreign relations than Assange under Ecuador's citizens' revolution. So the country looks considerably different today than it did 9 years ago, before President Rafael Correa took the presidential sash. Before Correa, domination of business and politics in Ecuador by North American interests, overseen by a U.S. military base on the coast, resulted in no social and infrastructural investment whatsoever. The Citizens' Revolution has prioritized sovereignty and Latin American integration. As such, regional cooperation, integration, and solidarity have become the foundation of the country's policies. Ecuador reclaimed the U.S. military base in Manta in 2009. In September, Ecuador formally resumed control of the Manta military base, 10 years after it had been leased, rent-free, to the U.S. military as part of Plan Colombia. The decision to cancel the lease was applauded by the social movement, and in the country's new constitutional foreign armed forces are barred from being in the country at all. So President Correa was described in a U.S. cable as an ideologue with no political or government experience, that a cable sent in 2005 from the U.S. Embassy in Quito to Washington, encrypted. WikiLeaks published cables from 2005 and 2006 from the U.S. Embassy in the Ecuadorian capital city of Quito that revealed how the U.S. collaborated closely with conservative former President Lucio Gutierrez. He was president from 2003 to 2005, as you'll recall, and their objective was to undermine Correa's 2006 election. And one of the major reporters on this has been a paper called Green Left Weekly. The cables from 2005 reveal that then U.S. Ambassador to Ecuador, Christy Kinney, deplored the deposition of Gutierrez. By she means the fact that the government was demanding that he appear and answer questions. She said that he had been a great ally to American interests. These in top secret cables from the U.S. Embassy in Quito to Washington, which were captured by WikiLeaks and then published by Green Left Weekly. The Congress removed Gutierrez from office in April 2005 after massive protests against his neoliberal policies. He especially advocated for the signature of the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, FTAA, and collaborated closely with the U.S. War on Drugs program. These War on Drugs programs, as I think you know by now, are just the cover the CIA uses to infiltrate its agents everywhere that it possibly can. And at any rate, the same thing, of course, has been true in Ecuador. The most recent U.S. propaganda movies, like Narcos, and there's another one out there, I can't remember what it is, are disgusting in that they're obviously propaganda, but of course the average viewer won't know that because they won't understand, they don't know any of the details there. But I do know the details, and I know some of the people that they have targeted and try and make look bad, like Jorge, well, a whole bunch of them that are really actually were pretty fine fellows from my way of looking at things. But at any rate, the Congress removed him from office, and the U.S. Embassy wasn't happy about it. He was temporarily replaced by President Alfredo Palacio, and Kenny said, the ambassador that is, that it would be difficult to imagine an Ecuadorian government in which he enjoyed greater access, as the U.S. Embassy had cultivated a wide range of contacts and had excellent access to high government officials, the military high command, and civil society leaders and opinion makers under Guterres' mandate. She said in 2 different cables captured by WikiLeaks and published by Green Left Weekly. Kenny even deplored that the embassy's best efforts had not prevented Guterres' forced resignation. Green Left Weekly added, regarding the U.S. War on Drugs program, the cables evidence how the embassy planned to use the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, to convince the Ecuadorian government to embrace Plan Colombia, funding infrastructure programs in the northern border region of Ecuador, among others, would help the embassy through the USAID to combat misinformation that U.S. government assistance in the Andes is strictly military, says a top-secret 2005 U.S. Embassy cable. This argument served Foreign Minister Fernando Carrion in February 2006 when he complained against the disastrous consequences of Plan Colombia. Another cable revealed, Plan Colombia consisted in U.S. financial assistance for Colombia in order to militarize the conflicts against the guerrilla groups and the drug cartels. It provoked the displacement of thousands of refugees to Ecuador, while the fumigation of coca crops intoxicated many people at the Ecuadorian border. The embassy also lobbied to avoid the defeat of Occidental Petroleum, Oxy, a U.S. petroleum company, against whom the Ecuadorian government had launched a lawsuit over alleged contract violations. When Correa entered the government of Palacio, the embassy became increasingly worried by this, quote, brash young economy minister, unquote, known for being a, quote, determined enemy of the FTA, Free Trade Area, unquote. Because Correa increased public spending, in contrast with gringo IMF, WB, World Bank, austerity policies implemented by Guterres, the embassy urged the White House to use its influence with international financial institutions to ensure that loans to Ecuador were withheld and that they would not be resumed until Correa and the Ecuador government committed themselves to minimally responsible policies as determined by the U.S. ambassador. The World Bank and the funds of the Inter-American Development Bank, which was always just a CIA front organization, were blocked until the International Monetary Fund would assess the Andean economy. Since Correa took office in 2007, the U.S. military base, as well as U.S. aid, have been expelled from the country, as we've seen. The Ecuadorian government also canceled a cooperation fund which the U.S. government financed to finance police expenditures, including salaries, for obvious reasons. Nobody wants their police funded by another country. After doing so, President Correa expelled Armando Astorga, an attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Quito, who criticized the government's Manta decision. In 2011, after WikiLeaks revealed several U.S. diplomatic cables from 2009, where Ambassador Heather Hodges blamed the head of the police force, Jaime Hurtado Vaca, of being corrupt and claimed that Correa must have also known and was therefore also corrupt, the president requested the ambassador to explain herself for the accusations. But after receiving no response from the embassy, he kicked her out of the country. At any rate, once elected, Correa called for renegotiation of what he called Ecuador's illegitimate U.S. $10.2 billion external debt. He said this debt was accrued during autocratic and corrupt regimes of the past, and Correa said Ecuador would not pay a fraudulent debt. He then ordered the exposure of the World Bank's country manager as a fraudster. Quote, "Will Ecuador turn into Latin America's Greece?" unquote, was a ludicrous question posed thereafter by The Economist magazine. Quote, "The Correa administration has introduced regulations that would allow it to issue electronic money and central bank paper. That way lies Greece," warns Abelardo Pacano, a former banker. "Printing quasi-currency risks a run on the banks by savers who fear deposits would not be returned in dollars. The central bank has hard currency reserves of only $4.6 billion. Mr. Correa, seeming to recognize the danger, has been incautious in implementing these measures," unquote. Now, is there any truth to this? In short, no. This is a usual set of U.S. government lies about what's going on. Because, first of all, since 2007, when President Rafael Correa first took office, Ecuador's reserves have fluctuated from 2 to 6.5 billion. One of the main reasons for holding reserves does not apply in Ecuador. It need not worry about speculative tax on its currency because since 2000, its currency has been the U.S. dollar. The claim that Ecuador is printing quasi-currency is an attempt to spread panic that it is abandoning the dollar. Secondly, Ecuador has introduced a system that allows people to swap U.S. dollars for an equal value of electronic money they can store on their cell phones. It is similar to depositing cash to a bank account and then using a debit card to make purchases. Governments do not introduce quasi-currencies by allowing people to use debit cards. This debit card system has been in use in Colombia since my first visit there in the year 2000, and the system was introduced because more people have cell phones in Ecuador than bank accounts. Ecuador's cap press has admitted this. Thirdly, Greece never issued a quasi-currency, as The Economist misleads. Since 2010, Greece has experienced a Great Depression level of collapse because of austerity measures forced on it by the Troika, which is the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, and the European Central Bank. The recent run on Greek banks was deliberately caused by the European Central Bank. It cut liquidity to the Greek banking system to blackmail Greece into accepting continued austerity measures. Fortunately, the U.S. cannot similarly blackmail Ecuador because its banks are not supported by the Federal Reserve. Vaguely describing Abelardo Pacano as a former banker is a very disingenuous thing to do because Pacano was head of Ecuador's central bank under the administration of Osvaldo Hurtado, who was president from 81 through 84. According to Hurtado himself, Pacano helped his government mastermind one of the most infamous private sector bailouts in Ecuadorian history, which is referred to as the secretization. Now, what does that mean? Well, in those years, Ecuador's cap banks owed a very dangerous level of debt to foreigners in U.S. dollars. In 1983, Hurtado's government took responsibility for paying the private cap bank dollar-denominated debt. In return, the private sector was allowed to pay the Ecuadorian government in sucres, Ecuador's national currency at the time. The government of Febrero Cordero from 84 to 88 further sweetened this deal for the Ecuadorian cap elite. It was a classic example of socialism for the rich. By 1994, the accumulated cost of secretization to the Ecuadorian treasury was US $4.4 billion, according to a commission established by Correa's government. That amount is equal to 25% of Ecuador's GDP in 1994. The findings of the commission provided the legal basis for Ecuador's default on a third of its public debt in 2008 as fraud. 5. The fraudster Pacano writes lies regularly for El Comercio, one of the largest Ecuador newspapers. Now, how would the economists square this fact with their statement that Correa's government has bullied the media into self-censorship? Likewise, Ecuavisa, a private TV broadcaster, last year introduced a guest to spread alarm about electronic money. Alfredo Pinocorte quickly ran through a list of many of the same allegations against Correa's government made by The Economist. How does Ecuavisa square this fact with their statement that the government is suppressing freedom of expression? Point number 6. The Economist closes by warning Correa that he faces a choice. He could persist in his bid for permanent power and risk being kicked out by the street like his predecessors, or he could swallow his pride, stabilize the economy, and drop his re-election bid. He would then go down in history as one of Ecuador's most successful presidents. Now, how could a person plotting for permanent power be one of Ecuador's most successful presidents? The bit about permanent power refers to the National Assembly possibly amending the Constitution to abolish term limits for all elected officials. Does The Economist, a UK-based magazine, say that David Cameron has permanent power because the UK does not have term limits? Under the present Ecuadorian Constitution, which was written by elected representatives shortly after Correa took office and ratified in a national 2008 referendum, Article 105 allows voters to subject the president to a recall referendum. The UK does not allow recall referendums, does not have a constitution, and still calls itself a kingdom. Given there are fewer democratic options available to UK voters, would The Economist advise David Cameron to capitulate when faced being ousted by the street? And finally, point number 7, because of the government's actions, Ecuador was able to renegotiate its debt with its creditors and redirect public funds towards social investments. Now, let's take a look at some of these facts. Much else has changed since the days when banksters like Abelardo Picano put Ecuador through ruinous decades that culminated in a major economic collapse in 1999. Under the new Constitution, Articles 130 and 148, the National Assembly cannot dismiss the President, or vice versa, without new elections being held immediately for both the presidency and the National Assembly. The Ecuadorian cap elite can no longer dominate the media, which they denounce as a crackdown on freedom of expression, a propaganda chant picked up by the international cap press and gringo NGOs. South American governments have also reacted strongly against recent coups and coup attempts, thanks in part to WikiLeaks. Washington's capacity to destabilize Correa's government has been greatly reduced, which is another good reason for Ecuador to protect Julian Assange. Ecuador granted diplomatic asylum to the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, on August 16, 2012, despite intense pressure from the U.S. and European governments. Correa's government is already one of the most successful in Ecuador's history because it has rejected the neoliberal dogmas promoted by The Economist. The Center for Economic and Policy Research shows this in a very detailed assessment of Ecuador's central economic policy since 2007. Nevertheless, despite so much positive change, the threat of a coup is ever present. As we have seen, the CIA and the fascist Ecuadorian right launched a coup attempt in 2010 in which Correa was briefly held a hostage by mutinous police. If The Economist valued democracy at all, it would not regurgitate the talking points of the people who want a coup, much less tell Correa to obey a violent minority. This past December, Ecuador inaugurated its new headquarters for the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, a regional platform for South American nations to strengthen economic and political ties, as you know. At the inauguration of this building, which is located symbolically next to the middle of the world monument just north of Quito, Correa said UNASUR covers 400 million people and 17 million square miles. By uniting, we could be the fourth largest economy in the world, with 6% of the gross domestic product in the world, a third of the world's fresh water on the planet, and first in food production and hydrocarbon reserves for the next 100 years. The ALBA regional organization works toward South American liberator Simón Bolívar's vision of social, political, and economic integration and cooperation. And originally, these initials stood for Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, and although the name had changed twice to Bolivarian Alliance for Our America and one other, this alliance of the four progressive capitals, countries, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, retained these initials, and Ecuador became a member of ALBA in 2009. And a year later, Ecuador and Venezuela made the first bilateral trade agreement using ALBA's digital Sucre currency. Ecuador also plans to open the ALBA Cultural Center dedicated to the promotion of each member's nation's cultures and identities. Now, Ecuador, China, and CELAC. Correa is Ecuador's first president to visit China in an official capacity, and his trip marked a new era of cooperation between the two nations. Correa's visit strengthened renewable energy projects as well as financial cooperation. And during his visit, China committed to providing scholarships for more than 300 Ecuadorian students. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations held a historic summit with China January 8th and 9th of this year, 2016, in Beijing. Latin America's old imperial capitalist neighbor in the north is losing to a new investor, China. And China does not attach strings to its loans, nor judgment of different social structures and politics. CELAC unites 33 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. It was launched in Venezuela in 2011, when representatives of each country signed the Declaration of Caracas. The declaration seeks to consolidate integration within the Americas and to reduce the overarching power of the U.S. in that region. The CELAC member nations set to benefit from new links with China are Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, St. Kitts and Nevis, Santa Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Uruguay, and Venezuela. I have seen the results of some of this Chinese investment in a few of these countries, and it's especially the Bahamas. It's striking to me how quickly and how much the Bahamas has changed from being just a place for gringos to go to have a vacation, especially from Miami, to being a major center of all kinds of cultural and sports activities for the entire Caribbean region. Thanks to the Chinese having built a huge series of stadiums and resorts there that dwarf anything that existed on Paradise Island. At any rate, how Latin America and China are strengthening ties. CELAC is a coalition of these 33 Latin American nations and Caribbean nations and represents 600 million people. Initially in 2010, it was the Rio Group Unity Summit in Mexico. Then it became CELAC, this is CELAC. After signing the Declaration of Caracas, it was created as a conscious alternative to the U.S. instruments, which are the OAS, the Organization for American States, and the Summit of the Americas, both of which excluded Cuba until recently, and of course are headquartered in Washington. Former President of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, was one of the chief promoters and founders of CELAC. Chavez was a relentless promoter of Latin American and Caribbean unity and South-South cooperation as a counterweight to U.S. hegemony. During Chinese President Xi Jinping's regional visit last year, which included stopovers in Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, and Brazil, Xi participated in the inaugural China-CELAC Summit and announced a U.S. $35 billion fund for the region. This includes $20 billion U.S. dollars for regional infrastructure projects, a $10 billion U.S. dollars credit line for CELAC nations from the Bank of China, as well as a $5 billion investment for the China-Latin American Cooperation Fund. Gringo attacks on China's aid to Latin America have three foci. First, some pessimists also look at China's short-term challenges and ignore its long-term development capability and potential. Short-term challenges and difficulties are temporary and will be overcome as its government has the determination to succeed. Secondly, gringo pundits do not understand that the Chinese government is far better than they think. and that political stability is the foundation of the success of China. And thirdly, gringo propagandists China underestimate China's ability and determination, supported by the Chinese people, who are not only hardworking, intelligent, but also resilient to all kinds of challenges and shocks. The financial commitment from China to CELAC member nations marks the strengthening of ties between the world's largest economy, that is China, based on purchasing power parity, and Latin America. China is increasingly looking to Latin America to expand its comprehensive strategic partnership, most recently as evidenced by President Xi's state visit to the region that resulted in at least 140 bilateral agreements. A survey carried out by the Pew Research Center in July of 2013 revealed that China was perceived more positively than the U.S. by the Latin American commodities exporters surveyed, and this included Venezuela at 71%, Brazil at 65%, Chile at 62%, and many Latin American countries also view China as an important market for agricultural produce, oil, and mineral resources, as well as increasingly crucial source of loans and investment capital. As China continues to deepen its ties with Latin America, CELAC will undoubtedly continue to play an important role as one of the region's leading bodies. Ecuador in particular is set to benefit from Chinese investment. Marking 35 years of diplomatic relations between China and Ecuador, President Correa oversaw the signing of some 14 agreements that seek to strengthen bilateral relations on his first official visit. Chinese President Xi Jinping and President Correa have said that the increased cooperation is strategic for mutual development. And Correa said in Beijing that the Chinese-based Exim Bank would grant U.S. $5 billion to Ecuador to finance various development projects throughout the country. As part of his first official trip to China, President Correa met with bank executives in order to enhance financial cooperation in the area of renewables. Now in this chapter, I go on to talk about in detail Ecuador's relations with Africa, what it's done in Haiti to help the people there after the earthquake, what it's done to help the people in the Gaza Strip after Israel's 2014 assault on them. Ecuador's rejection of financial terrorism, however, is probably the most important single thing for people listening to this lecture to be aware of. In the process, Ecuador joined Bolivia and Venezuela in rejecting the extreme free market policies that were forced on Latin America by the International Monetary Fund and other U.S. instruments of financial terrorism. Correa said in 2014, "People must prevail over capital. Politics has been about the elites against the people, capital versus humankind. Policies and programs depend on who holds the balance of power." Before his election, economist and university professor Correa had served as the economy minister during the interim government of Alfredo Palacio, and who succeeded ousted President Lucio Gutierrez. The country had seen increasing political instability after the economy collapsed in the private banking crisis of 1999. Out of that crisis in 2002, Ecuador adopted the U.S. dollar as its national currency. Unemployment skyrocketed, and 1 in 10 Ecuadorians fled the country. As economy minister, Correa expressed his opposition to Palacio's plans in this regard and his signing of a free trade agreement with the United States. And Correa then resigned over the World Bank loan. Rebuilding the country. Ahead of the 2006 elections, Correa and several other Ecuadorian politicians founded the PAIS Alliance, PAIS, as a political party. PAIS proposed the drafting of a new constitution to solve the crisis facing Ecuador. After Correa took office, a constituent assembly was convoked and a new constitution ratified by popular referendum, and since then, the Citizens' Revolution, a name chosen by Correa's supporters commemorating the mass demonstrations that ousted his predecessors, has strengthened the Ecuadorian state, restoring its role in that country's economic development. Under Correa, Ecuador's economy performed strongly, averaging 4% growth, among the best in the region. Most importantly, this growth has also favored the poorest people in the country, who are the majority by far. Thus, Ecuador has outpaced other Latin American countries in reduction of inequality. Success was achieved in spite of the fact that President Correa came to office on the eve of the global financial crisis, and Ecuador being hampered by not having its own currency. Correa rehabilitated Ecuador via public investment. He made it clear that there is a role for cap market in some areas, but it cannot dominate the economy. In short, societies have market, but society is not markets. Strong growth of emphasis, social investment over the servicing of foreign debt. Accordingly, the Ecuadorian poverty index has fallen by 1/3, with over 1.5 million people lifted out of poverty since 2007. The Citizens' Revolution in Ecuador is one of the most authentic revolutions in Latin America. For example, the minimum wage in 2016 will be one of the highest in Latin America. There was a comprehensive reform of the country's labor laws last year, in 2015, that expanded the rights and protections of workers. The Republic recognized homemakers, and they were incorporated into the Social Security system for the first time in the country's history, so that women who spend their life taking care of their families are now covered by Social Security. Ecuador now has the lowest unemployment rate in history at 4.28%. Education and health were pitifully funded under previous governments. The Citizens' Revolution funded both fully. Free education up to university level and implementing free health care are cornerstones of the Republic. Ecuador will build 400 new schools by 2017. Ecuador now has the second highest level of public investment in higher education in the entire world. The Correa government has targeted tax evasion by the very rich to fund these programs. Ecuador now raises 3 times more in taxes than it did in 2006, and the rich, along with their CIA compadres, have responded by trying to overthrow the government violently. President Correa was one of the most popular presidents in Latin American history. Public approval in Ecuador of governance, reduction of corruption, and the distribution of wealth is the highest in the entire region. Political stability has returned to the Andean nation. The president was re-elected in 2009, following the adoption of the new constitution, re-elected again in 2013. Popular support has also helped him win popular referendums in 2007, 2008, and 2011. Correa and his supporters have won 10 elections since 2007. Correa's attempts to refound the nation have included an emphasis on ending discrimination against indigenous communities. During his first election campaign in 2006, Correa addressed his supporters in Quechua, the country's most widely spoken indigenous language. In 2007, with help from the Venezuelan government, Ecuador inaugurated its first public TV station. Together with state-owned radio station, they promote programs in Quechua and other indigenous languages, and this has boosted the use of different native foreign languages which were formerly endangered. Laws to protect minorities have implemented, including a law which compels companies to reserve 4% of jobs for people with disabilities and other quota for minority ethnic groups such as indigenous communities and the Afro-Ecuadorians in order to narrow the inequality gap, and this policy has been applied in the country's higher education system where indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian community enrollments soared. Now, there has been fierce opposition from the old elite and its allies in Washington to all of this. With the new media law approved in 2013, the indigenous communities have greater access to community media. The law assigns 34% of the country's radio and TV frequencies to community media. 14 radio frequencies have been assigned for all the country's indigenous groups. The government promotes native languages and cultural expressions by training personnel, providing special funding to supporting those and these, including small media outlets. The new disability law means that people with physical and mental disabilities are adequately assisted, and large-scale government campaigns have tackled discrimination against them and improved their inclusion into Venezuelan society. And some of you may have noticed that one of Ecuador's vice presidents is in a wheelchair. At any rate, he has become an inspiration to people with physical disabilities throughout the nation. Fierce opposition, oh, well, I already read that. Ecuador's communication law democratizes the airwaves and is commemorating its 2-year anniversary. Now, before the implementation of the law, Ecuador's media landscape was considered a free-for-all for capitalists, with their media outlets operating as the virtual propaganda arms of their wealthy owners. Quote, when we came into government in 2007, there were 5 TV channels in Ecuador, 4 of them owned by the 4 biggest banks in the country, unquote. Ecuadorian Culture Minister Guillaume Long told Telesur in an exclusive interview, we've had a series of referendums to separate capital invested in media from capital invested in financial institutions. The Ecuadorian people have supported democratization of the media, said Long. Now there is a clear separation between bankers and media outlets. This law also creates 2 important regulatory bodies, the Supercom and the Correa, which work to ensure that media outlets are operating in a responsible way. Sensitive material that contains violence and sexual imagery are broadcast at the appropriate times, and the law also obliges outlets to report news accurately. Broadcasters are not issuing unsubstantiated claims that could endanger the public or slander individuals, as is common in many countries that fail to adhere to rules. That is, these outlets that fail to adhere to rules face a fine from regulatory bodies. However, in the 2 years since the law has been in effect, out of 1,144 outlets, only 198 have been penalized for anything. The law redistributes public airwaves into 3 parts, a third for private outlets, a third for state-owned outlets, and a third for community and grassroots outlets. Space on the radio spectrum is one of the most important achievements of the communications law, as it means a radical change in the communication structure of the country. Sandy Chavez, coordinator of networks at Correa, a community media group, told Telesur that government efforts have gone a long way. I believe the government is working hard in communication processes between people and nationalities. 18 community radios have been implemented at a national level to strengthen processes of communicating between people from distinct nationalities. She said all that. Anyway, like Ochoa, Francisco Sierra is also hoping that with 2 years of experience under their belts, lawmakers will make reforms to the law itself to help better achieve its objective. And I go through some of this debate that I'm not going to go through over here. What about the backlash? Attempts to disempower the old elites entrenched over the centuries met with concerted attack by right-wing politicians, of course, and in order they're working directly with the CIA. And to the degree that there is any independence in the State Department from the Pentagon, with them too. First of all, the U.S. military base was closed, and that was important because it enforced imperial rule on Ecuador. This is the base at Manta, and much of South America. Secondly, Ecuador asserted control over the country's oil and other natural resources, taking them away from domination by multinationals. Now, at this point, I might just add that when I was working as a manager for NL Industries, we had a fellow in Ecuador named Wally Reed, and he had been doing a pretty successful program of pipe recovery there, where Ecuador was doing quite a bit of oil drilling. Now, a point came when Schlumberger told the government of Ecuador, Schlumberger being the big company we discussed before, headquartered in France, but that was made into the biggest company in the world by Joseph Stalin, who brought them to the Soviet Union for 10 years, making the Schlumberger family the wealthiest family in France then and now. At any rate, Schlumberger told the Ecuadorian government, well, we're leaving at the end of this contract, and because we want all of the business and you're giving business to other people, like these Americans under this company, NL McCullough. That was before NL bought it. But at any rate, like this McCullough company, which was there to do all of this back-off work, and they said, well, we want all of that too, or we're leaving. Now, the problem is that Schlumberger at the time was the only company that could do open-hole logging to 35,000 feet. Even Halliburton had an open-hole company, but they couldn't drill that deep. They couldn't log that deep. So the government really had no choice but to do what they were told by Schlumberger, which in this case is the reason I'm pointing it out. These multinational oil and oil field service companies tell the Ecuadorian government what they're going to do, and they either do it or else. So this is the kind of thing that came to an end under Correa. In my day, back in the days I'm talking about, McCulloch had to pull out of Ecuador altogether, and that was the end of that. And we reconcentrated in Mexico. But at any rate, Ecuador also canceled the punishing international debt. 3 times as much had been spent by banker-controlled governments on debt repayment than they'd spent on social services. I think you can see what that is all about. The CIA spearheads fascism by directing fierce opposition, mobilizing the old elite, and launching the 2010 coup against Ecuador's elected government. This proved how concerned the old ruling families were with Correa's successes. As we've seen, the coup began on September 30th, 2010, as a police strike holding the president hostage in a hospital for several hours. I won't go over all of that again, but the CIA paid these demonstrators. That was eventually proven, and so we don't need to go through the details of that. They are in your book, the proof of who got paid, when, and how. If you're interested, when you get a copy of this 2016 version with Chapter 57 in it, then you'll have it. At any rate, all of that has gone on, and there's more investigation continues. There was all kinds of persecution that went on under previous governments that is now the subject of various kinds of investigations in Ecuador. The CIA's fascist right in Ecuador is plotting with counterparts in Venezuela. And in January, just a month ago, the CIA arranged meetings between this new bunch of fascists in the Venezuelan National Assembly and their counterparts in Ecuador. Of course, the Ecuadorian secret police and the Venezuelan Direction of Revolutionary Military Intelligence are keeping a close eye on all of this, and they have the Cuban DGI with over 50 years fighting U.S. imperialism to help them. So I don't think any of this activity against Ecuador is going to be successful. As recently as a few days ago, Correa fired his entire military high command, and the technical reason for it, the immediate fight, had to do with the fact that these guys had been, in the military high command, had been using money for their own purposes. And when they were ordered to repay it, they refused to do that, and so Correa fired all of them and appointed an entirely new military high command. The details of this are being covered by Telesur, especially on a daily basis. But now Ecuador has a new and presumably more loyal army than he's ever had before. Now, at this particular point, I think I want to call this to a conclusion. Correa is not going to run, as far as we know, again next year, but he's built a tremendous infrastructure there. There are plenty of people in País that are capable of taking the presidency for another term, and Correa's a young man. He can come back if he likes. One of the things that strikes me is that Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, these are guys that are really tough, and they're real smart, and they have earned the respect of their own people. They're not going to be easily overthrown by a bunch of ignoramuses who are not much different than Hank Schrader. If you remember, the guy was chasing his own brother-in-law for over a year on Breaking Bad. So, sure, it's worrisome to see that the CIA keeps this whack-a-mole thing going, but they're not going to have any more luck than Wiley Coyote had in chasing the Roadrunner, in my opinion. So, at any rate, we're going to conclude this lecture on Ecuador, and the next one, which will be in the not-too-distant future, will be on the current situation in Bolivia. I think I'll wait until after the election this weekend in Bolivia to see how that turns out. But Morales has countered the CIA there again, which has been conspiring to keep this government from winning the elections. We'll talk about that in the next lecture.